Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. Machiavelli, Chapter 1. The dangerous illusion of powerlessness. Let me guess, you feel invisible, like the people around you got a head start you never got, better connections, better luck, better timing. You watch people move up while you stay exactly where you are, and somewhere deep down, you've started believing a very dangerous idea. That power belongs to people who were already given it, that you either have it or you don't, that without money, without a name, without a network, you're simply not in the game. But here's the part nobody tells you. You've been sold a half-truth. You were told power comes from position, a title, a bank account, a birthright. What they didn't tell you is that position is just the asterisk appearance asterisk of power. Real power is something else entirely. It's built, not given. And it's built in the exact conditions you're in right now, with nothing. Machiavelli understood this better than almost anyone in history. He didn't write for kings born into thrones. He wrote for men who had to claw their way into rooms they weren't invited to. He said, "Men rise from one ambition to another. First they seek to secure themselves, and then they attack others. Power isn't a gift, it's a sequence. And most people never even take the first step because they're waiting for permission that will never come. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people never hear. You don't feel powerless because you lack resources. You feel powerless because you don't have a strategy. Power doesn't begin when your circumstances improve. It begins the moment your behavior changes. I didn't learn this from a book. I learned it the hard way. There was a time I believed power was something other people handed you, a promotion, an invitation, an introduction to the right person. I waited. I stayed polite. I stayed patient. And nothing moved. It wasn't until I stopped waiting to be chosen and started studying how power actually gets built, quietly, deliberately, without asking anyone's permission, that things finally shifted. That's when Machiavelli stopped being philosophy to me and started being a manual. History proves this again and again. Take Cesare Borgia. He wasn't born a ruler of provinces. He was handed a fractured, half-conquered territory, riddled with enemies who despised him. He had no loyal army of his own in the beginning, no guaranteed allegiance, no love from the people he governed. What he had was a method. He studied who held real influence versus who merely appeared to. He removed threats before they could organize. He built order out of chaos, not through charm, but through calculated, controlled action. Machiavelli watched this up close and drew a conclusion that still holds today. Power favors the person who acts with intention, not the person who waits for good fortune. Most people do the opposite of this. They wait for someone to notice them. They wait for the right moment. They wait for confidence to arrive before they act, instead of acting their way into confidence. That's not strategy. That's surrender disguised as patience. And Machiavelli had no respect for people who waited. He believed fortune is like a river. It floods and destroys the unprepared, but the prepared build channels and turn the flood into power. So let's flip this. Principle 1. In a world that rewards the bold, the first thing you must destroy is your own hesitation. Chapter 2. Principle 1. Act before you feel ready. Think about it like this. If you wait until you feel completely ready to act, you will wait forever, because readiness is a feeling, not a fact. Confidence doesn't create action. Action creates confidence. That's backwards from what almost everyone believes. Now, this is where people push back. They say, I don't have the experience yet. But that's not logic. That's an excuse. Because experience isn't a prerequisite for action. It's an asterisk result, asterisk of it. Let's say you want influence in a group, a company, a room full of people who don't yet know your name. Before you have proof, before you have credentials, before anyone validates you, you have to make one small, decisive move. Speak first in the meeting. Offer the idea before someone else does. Reach out to the person you're intimidated by. Is that going to change everything overnight? No, but that's not what it's doing. What it's actually doing is rewiring your identity. It's training your brain to accept one powerful truth. Power is claimed, not awarded. This is how real power starts. Not with permission, not with a lucky break, but with small decisive actions that feel almost reckless at first. Napoleon Bonaparte understood this early. He wasn't from a wealthy or politically connected family by the standards of French aristocracy. He was a minor nobleman from Corsica, an outsider in Parisian military circles who was mocked for his accent and his background. But he didn't wait to be accepted. He volunteered for the difficult assignments no one else wanted. He acted decisively at Toulon when officers senior to him hesitated, and that single moment of seizing initiative launched his rise. He once said, in essence, that he made his plans out of the dreams of half-asleep men, meaning while others hesitated, he moved. What he understood, without saying it directly, is that initiative is a form of self-respect. Acting before you feel ready is a signal, a declaration that you're done waiting for the world to hand you permission. Most people never make this shift. They keep saying, "Once I know more, I'll speak up. Once I feel confident, I'll take the risk. Once things settle down, I'll make my move." But Machiavelli had no patience for one-day people. He believed power belongs to those who act even with incomplete information, especially with incomplete information, because acting under uncertainty is what separates rulers from spectators. Now here's what's interesting. Once you start acting before you feel ready, something subtle begins to happen. People start responding to you differently. You stop being someone things happen to, and you start being someone who makes things happen. And that shift, even though it's quiet at first, is what separates people who eventually gain influence from those who stay invisible forever. You're no longer waiting for the room to open a seat for you. You're pulling up a chair. Now pause for a second. Think about one place in your life where you've been waiting to feel ready. Put it into 1 or 2 words in your mind, because that awareness is the first real move. And once you start acting decisively, you'll notice something else. Not everyone will like it. And that discomfort is exactly where the next principle begins. Chapter 3. Principle 2. Being feared beats being liked. When you must choose. Here's what happens next. The moment you start acting decisively, taking positions, making moves, you stop being universally liked. For a lot of people, that's where panic kicks in. They think, this isn't working. Why do people suddenly seem cold toward me? But this is actually the turning point. Machiavelli would call this the moment of truth, when pressure exposes reality and illusions start to collapse. Because what you're about to realize is this. It's not that you did something wrong. It's that power always creates friction. And if you've never felt friction, you've probably never actually exercised power. Machiavelli's most famous and most misunderstood line is this: "It is safer to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both." People hear that and imagine cruelty. That's not what it means. It means this: love is unreliable because it depends on other people's feelings, which change constantly. Respect, boundaries, and consequences are reliable because they depend on you. Let me ask you something honestly. Have you ever avoided setting a boundary because you were afraid someone might not like you afterward? Not casually, actually afraid, like their approval was oxygen. That fear is exactly what keeps people powerless. Because a person with no boundaries isn't loved more, they're simply used more. Machiavelli warned that rulers who only sought to be loved by everyone ended up respected by no one, because love without boundaries invites exploitation. The same applies here. Being universally liked is not power, it's exposure. This happens once, then again, then it becomes expected. And slowly, without ever noticing the shift, you've become someone whose time isn't respected because you never demanded that it be. That gap between wanting to be liked and needing to be respected, that's where your power is quietly leaking. Power is rarely taken from you in one dramatic confrontation. It's taken through hundreds of small yeses you never meant to give. Now, here's the important part. This doesn't mean becoming cold or cruel. It means becoming someone whose respect has to be earned and whose boundaries have consequences. When you start doing this, something uncomfortable happens. You stop being everyone's easiest option. Some people will pull away. Let them. Because Machiavelli believed that once you understand this trade-off clearly, you're forced to choose. And most people never even reach that point. Chapter 4. Principle 3. Control the narrative before others do. This is where most people lose power without ever realizing it. They let other people define who they are. Every group, every workplace, every social circle runs on stories. And if you don't tell your own story, someone else will tell it for you, and it usually won't be flattering. Think about this. In any room, there's a version of you that exists in other people's heads, built from fragments. A comment you made once, a mistake from years ago, a first impression that never got updated. If you never actively shape that narrative, you become whatever the loudest voice in the room decided you were. Machiavelli understood the power of perception more than almost anyone. He wrote that people judge by appearances because most people only have eyes, not judgment. Meaning most people react to what they see on the surface, not what's actually true underneath. That's not cynicism, that's a warning. If you don't control how you're perceived, you will be perceived incorrectly, and that incorrect perception will make real decisions about your life. Abraham Lincoln, before he became president, was mocked relentlessly for his background. A self-taught rural lawyer with no polish, no wealth, no political dynasty behind him. His opponents tried to define him as unfit, unsophisticated, unworthy of the office. Instead of hiding from that narrative, he reframed it. He leaned into his simplicity and turned it into a symbol of honesty and closeness to ordinary people. The rail splitter who understood real struggle. He controlled the story before his enemies could finish writing it for him. Here's what that looks like in your life. Maybe you made a mistake at work last year, and now, without saying anything out loud, that mistake has quietly become who you are in people's minds. Maybe you were shy once in a group, and now you're permanently filed away as the quiet one, even though you've changed. If you never correct it, that outdated version of you becomes your ceiling. Most people avoid this. They think shaping their own narrative is arrogant, so they stay silent and let assumptions calcify into reputation. That silence is expensive. Machiavelli would call it handing your enemies, or simply your competitors, a weapon they didn't even have to earn. Now pause for a second. Think about one assumption people currently hold about you that isn't true anymore. 1 or 2 words is enough, because until you actively correct that story, you're not being seen. You're being remembered as someone you no longer are. And once you start controlling your own narrative, you'll notice the next challenge immediately, knowing exactly who around you is actually on your side. Chapter 5. Principle 4. Build alliances, but verify loyalty. Once you start gaining any ground, visibility, influence, opportunity, a new problem appears. People start showing up who suddenly want to be close to you. And the temptation is to trust all of it, because after years of feeling invisible, attention feels like validation. But Machiavelli warned that this exact moment is the most dangerous one. He said that men are so simple and so subject to present necessities that a deceiver will never lack victims for his deceptions, meaning people are far too easily fooled by whoever is standing in front of them, offering something convenient in the moment. The same applies in reverse. As your influence grows, you become the convenient one others will try to attach themselves to, not always for genuine reasons. This doesn't mean trust no one. It means verify before you rely. Alliances built on convenience collapse under pressure. Alliances built on tested loyalty hold. The Medici family in Renaissance Florence rose from relatively modest banking origins to command enormous political power. And one of the core reasons they survived decades of plots, betrayals, and rival families trying to unseat them was this: they didn't hand out trust freely. They rewarded consistency over time, tested people in smaller matters before involving them in larger ones, and paid extremely close attention to who stayed loyal when it cost something, versus who was only loyal when it was easy. Here's what that looks like in real life. Someone becomes suddenly warm toward you the moment you get a promotion, or land an opportunity, or start showing signs of success. Before, they were distant. Now they're enthusiastic. That shift itself is data. It doesn't mean they're automatically insincere, but it means you owe them observation, not immediate access to your trust. Most people skip this step entirely. They're so relieved to finally have allies that they hand out loyalty and vulnerability indiscriminately, and then they're shocked when it's exploited. That's not betrayal on the other person's part alone. That's a failure of verification on yours. Machiavelli's approach was almost scientific. Watch what people do under small pressure before you ever place something valuable in their hands. Who keeps a minor promise? Who speaks about others behind their backs? Who disappears the moment something requires effort with no immediate payoff? These small signals tell you everything before a crisis ever forces the truth out. Now, once you start filtering alliances this way, something changes. Your circle gets smaller, but it gets stronger. And that's exactly what allows you to move to the next principle, because a small, reliable circle is what makes bold action possible. Chapter 6, Principle 5. Strike decisively when the moment demands it. Most people are comfortable with slow, safe, incremental moves. What most people are not comfortable with is the moment that requires a decisive, uncomfortable, immediate action. Confronting someone, walking away from a bad deal, ending a relationship or partnership that's quietly draining them. That hesitation, in the exact moment it matters most, is where power dies. Machiavelli wrote about this with brutal clarity. He said injuries ought to be done all at once, so that being less tasted, they will give less offense, meaning half measures drag out pain, and give your opposition time to recover and retaliate. Decisive action taken cleanly and completely is far less damaging in the long run than a slow, hesitant, repeated struggle. This doesn't mean recklessness. It means this: once you've correctly identified that a bold move is necessary, delaying it doesn't make it safer. It just extends your exposure. Consider the story of Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon. He wasn't reckless. He had weighed the political reality for a long time. But once he understood that hesitation guaranteed his destruction by rivals in Rome, he moved decisively and irreversibly, famously saying, "The die is cast." That single decisive act, taken at exactly the right moment rather than delayed indefinitely, reshaped the entire trajectory of Roman history. Here's what this looks like in your actual life. Maybe there's a conversation you've been avoiding for months, telling someone their behavior is unacceptable, negotiating for what you're worth, ending an arrangement that quietly costs you more than it gives. Every day you delay it, the discomfort doesn't shrink. It compounds quietly, in the background, the same way debt does. Most people mistake delay for wisdom. They tell themselves they're being careful, patient, strategic. Sometimes that's true, but often it's simply fear wearing the costume of patience. Machiavelli had no respect for that disguise. He believed fortune is a woman who favors the young and bold, because the bold act while the outcome can still be shaped, while the cautious wait until the outcome has already been decided for them. Now pause again. Think of one decision you've been delaying that you already know the answer to. 1 or 2 words. Because that clarity is the first step toward finally moving. And once you start acting decisively instead of endlessly deliberating, you'll need something else to protect what that boldness builds. Which brings us to the next principle. Chapter 7. Principle 6. Adapt your approach to the situation, not your principles to the crowd. Here's a distinction almost nobody makes correctly. Adapting your strategy to circumstances is wisdom. Abandoning your principles to please whoever is in the room is weakness. And it's one of the fastest ways to lose the very power you're trying to build. Machiavelli observed something most people never articulate clearly. The times change, and a person's fortune depends on whether their behavior changes with them. A rigid person who refuses to adjust their methods eventually gets crushed by circumstances they refuse to acknowledge. But, and this is the part people miss, this is about method, not integrity. Your core values stay fixed, your tactics flex. Otto von Bismarck, the architect of German unification, is a perfect example. He was famously pragmatic, willing to ally with rivals he philosophically disagreed with when it served the larger goal, and willing to abandon methods that stopped working, even ones he'd previously championed. He called this realpolitik politics, based on practical circumstances rather than rigid ideology. But underneath that flexibility, his ultimate objective, a unified, strong German state, never wavered for decades. The method adapted constantly. The mission never did. Here's what that looks like in your own life. Maybe the way you communicated with people early in your career, polite, deferential, cautious, worked when you had nothing to protect. But as you gain more influence, that same approach might now be read as weakness or indecision. Adapting doesn't mean becoming a different person. It means recognizing that yesterday's strategy might not serve today's position. Most people do the opposite. They either refuse to adapt at all, clinging to, "This is just who I am," as an excuse to stay ineffective, or they adapt so completely that they lose any sense of who they actually are, changing their entire identity for whoever they're standing in front of. Both are traps. Machiavelli's actual guidance threads the needle: know your fixed objective and treat everything else, your tone, your approach, your timing, as a tool you're willing to sharpen or replace. Now, once you start separating your identity from your method, something becomes clear. You stop taking setbacks personally, because a failed approach isn't a failed you. It's simply a signal to adjust the method. And that mental separation is what allows the next principle to actually work. Chapter 8. Principle 7. Appear consistent, even while you calculate privately. This principle makes people uncomfortable, but it's one of the most important in Machiavelli's entire philosophy. What you show the world and what you're actually calculating internally do not have to be identical, and pretending otherwise is naive. He wrote that a prince must appear merciful, faithful, humane, and religious, and actually be so, but must have a mind so disposed that if circumstances demand the opposite, they know how to change. The public face and the private calculation are two different instruments, and confusing them is what makes people easy to manipulate. This doesn't mean being fake. It means understanding that your internal reasoning, your doubts, your strategy, your evaluation of who to trust and who to be cautious with, doesn't need to be broadcast in real time. Stability on the outside, even while you're actively recalculating on the inside, is what makes people trust and follow you. Queen Elizabeth I, again, offers a clear example. Privately, she deliberated for years, sometimes agonizingly, over decisions of marriage, war, and succession. Publicly, she projected calm, deliberate confidence, rarely letting courtiers or foreign ambassadors see the depth of her private uncertainty. That composed exterior, while intense calculation happened privately, is exactly what kept both allies and enemies from being able to predict or destabilize her. Here's what this looks like practically. You don't owe everyone real-time access to your doubts, your strategy, or your evolving opinion of them. If you're reconsidering a business partnership, you don't need to announce every stage of that reconsideration. If you're unsure whether to trust someone, you don't need to broadcast that uncertainty before you've confirmed it. Calm, consistent behavior on the surface buys you the time and space to actually think clearly underneath it. Most people do the opposite. They narrate every internal doubt out loud in real time, which makes them easy to read, easy to predict, and easy to manipulate. Machiavelli believed unpredictability, used sparingly and with discipline, is a form of protection, not dishonesty. Now, once you master this, staying composed outwardly while calculating carefully inward, you gain something extremely valuable: the ability to observe people's true intentions without tipping them off that you're watching. And that observation is exactly what the next principle depends on. Chapter 9. Principle 8. Never depend entirely on one source of power. This is where a lot of people who've actually made progress start to lose it. Not because they lack ability, but because everything they built rests on a single foundation. One boss, one relationship, one platform, one income source, one person's approval. And Machiavelli warned specifically against this kind of dependency. He observed that rulers who relied entirely on mercenaries or borrowed forces rather than their own strength were the most fragile, because the moment that outside support was withdrawn, they had nothing left to stand on. He said auxiliary or borrowed arms are useless and dangerous, because whoever gives them power to you can just as easily take it away. Translate that into modern terms. If your entire sense of security depends on one employer, one client, one relationship, one platform's algorithm, you don't actually hold power, you're borrowing it, and it can be recalled at any moment, for reasons that have nothing to do with your actual worth. Consider how the Rothschild banking family expanded across multiple European countries deliberately, placing sons in different nations rather than consolidating everything under a single throne's protection. This wasn't caution for its own sake, it was a structural safeguard. If one kingdom turned hostile, if one government seized assets, if one political alliance collapsed, the entire family's power didn't collapse with it, because it was never dependent on a single source to begin with. Here's what that looks like in your life. Maybe your entire professional identity depends on one company that could restructure tomorrow. Maybe your entire sense of self-worth depends on one relationship's approval. Maybe your entire income depends on one client who could leave without warning. None of that is inherently wrong to have. It's wrong to have it be your only time's foundation. Most people build their sense of security this way because it's simpler: one job, one relationship, one identity to maintain. But simplicity here is fragility, wearing a comfortable disguise. Machiavelli believed real strength comes from having multiple independent legs to stand on, so that no single betrayal, market shift, or rejection can collapse everything at once. Now pause again. Think of one area of your life where your entire foundation rests on a single point of failure, one or two words, because identifying that dependency is the first step toward finally diversifying your power. And once you start building multiple independent sources of strength, you need one more thing to make it last: patience with the process itself. Chapter 10, Principle 9. Patience is a weapon, not a weakness. Almost everyone building power for the first time makes the same mistake. They expect the results to arrive at the same speed as their effort. They put in real work for a few weeks or months, don't see dramatic external change, and conclude the whole approach isn't working. Machiavelli would have called this exactly what it is: impatience mistaken for wisdom. He wrote about the importance of laying foundations before the storm arrives, observing that those who fail to prepare during calm periods are destroyed the moment circumstances turn difficult, while those who quietly build during the quiet periods are the ones who survive and eventually dominate when conditions shift. Power built quickly is usually power built on borrowed structure, someone else's platform, someone else's money, someone else's permission, and it tends to collapse just as quickly once that borrowed structure is removed. Power built slowly through consistent, unglamorous effort tends to be the power that actually holds. Genghis Khan's rise is instructive here, stripped of the myth. He wasn't handed an empire. He spent years, after being abandoned and left with almost nothing as a young man, slowly building alliances, testing loyalty, absorbing defeated rivals into his own structure rather than simply destroying them, and consolidating strength methodically before ever attempting the large-scale campaigns he's remembered for. The dramatic expansion came only after a long, quiet, patient foundation had already been laid. Here's what that looks like in your actual life: the skill you're building that hasn't paid off yet, the relationship you're investing in that hasn't shown returns yet, the reputation you're quietly constructing that no one has fully noticed yet. All of it feels, in the moment, like it might be going nowhere. That feeling is not evidence that it's failing. It's simply evidence that you're in the part of the process that doesn't look impressive from the outside. Most people quit exactly here in the unglamorous middle because they mistake invisible progress for no progress. Machiavelli believed fortune rewards those who prepare during the calm, precisely because almost no one else is willing to do the boring work when there's no immediate applause for it. Now, once you accept that real power takes longer to build than you'd like, something shifts. You stop measuring yourself against unrealistic timelines, and you start measuring yourself against consistency instead. And that shift in measurement is exactly what makes the final principle possible. Chapter 11. Principle 10. Guard your reputation like a fortress. This is the principle that protects everything you've built through the first 9, because power that took years to construct can be damaged in a single careless moment if your reputation isn't actively guarded. Machiavelli placed enormous weight on reputation, not vanity, but strategic reputation, the accurate signal you send about how you operate, what you tolerate, and what consequences follow from crossing you. He wrote that a wise ruler must maintain the reputation that makes them respected, because reputation is often the only thing standing between stability and constant challenge from rivals testing your limits. This doesn't mean obsessing over what people think of you in a fragile, anxious way. It means being deliberate about what your actions communicate, because every action either reinforces or erodes the reputation that protects you. Think about the Duke of Wellington, who defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. His military reputation wasn't built on a single dramatic victory. It was built over years of disciplined, consistent decision-making that earned the trust of his soldiers and the caution of his enemies. That accumulated reputation meant that even before a single shot was fired in any given battle, opponents had already factored in his history of discipline and calculated risk. His reputation itself became a form of power, independent of the immediate circumstances. Here's what that looks like in your own life. Every time you follow through on a boundary you set, your reputation for meaning what you say strengthens. Every time you fold under pressure to avoid short-term discomfort, that same reputation weakens, and people quietly recalibrate how seriously they need to take you. This happens slowly, almost invisibly, transaction by transaction, until one day you either command a room the moment you walk into it, or you don't, and neither outcome happened by accident. Most people treat reputation as something that just happens to them, shaped entirely by other people's opinions. Machiavelli treated it as something actively constructed and defended, transaction by transaction, exactly like the other 9 principles you've just built. Now, here's the identity shift underneath everything we've covered. Power was never about the resources you started with. It was never about connections you didn't have or a name that opens doors automatically. It was about becoming someone who acts before feeling ready, who accepts being respected over being universally liked, who controls their own narrative, verifies loyalty before extending trust, strikes decisively when it matters, adapts method without abandoning principle, stays composed while calculating privately, refuses to depend on a single foundation, respects the slow timeline of real construction, and guards the reputation that protects it all. Machiavelli's final, quiet warning still applies. The fortress that protects a person is not stone or money, it is the respect they've earned through consistent, deliberate action. Everything else can be taken, that cannot. If this shifted the way you see what power actually requires, then don't stop here, because what you've heard in this video is only the surface. There are deeper layers of psychology, influence, and strategy that simply can't be covered in a single video, not because they don't exist, but because most people aren't ready to apply them yet. That's why most stay where they started. If you're not one of them, subscribe, because every video here is built to sharpen your thinking, increase your influence, and separate you from the crowd. No fluff, no noise, just strategy. Most people will watch this and move on. A few will apply it and change, decide which one you are.